Well, welcome to another edition of No Nonsense with Pamela Wallin. We're going to go back and look at a couple of pieces of legislation that we have been looking at throughout the year, troubling from my point of view, pieces of legislation, C11 and C18, different approaches to controlling the internet, controlling the content on the internet, and from my point of view, therefore controlling what you get to see and what kind of exchanges you have. The government has spent a lot of its political capital on this, and so we're always curious when government chooses priorities like that, just why. So we're going back to Michael Geist, a name and a face that you know. He's the Canadian Research Chair in Internet and E-commerce Law at the University of Ottawa, a member of the Centre for Law, Technology and Society. And he's been following these hearings along very closely, burning up Twitter to make sure we all understand what's going on. Michael, your thoughts just as we begin on why they are so intent on seeing these pieces of legislation passed with as little input from the outside world as possible.
Yeah, well, first off, thanks for having me back.
Yes.
You know, I must admit, I find it candidly a bit puzzling. There are deals to be made on both of these bills, but particularly on C11 that would force people to put a little bit of water in their wine, but generally, meet the needs and expectations and the government's own stated intent for this legislation, without causing the kind of controversy that we've seen. And yet, for whatever reason, the government is incredibly insistent on maintaining exactly what they've passed, as if this is kind of written on a pair of tablets and can't be changed. And I think it's a mistake. I think it's out of touch with where a great many Canadians are. We'll talk about both bills, but C18, which has received less attention. Just as the government was passing this bill in the House, you had one Liberal MP talk about this going to stop theft by large platforms of news articles. And, I see the reaction from both people in the media sector, but Canadians more broadly. And it tells me that, that interpretation of what takes place in the online news space is so out of touch with reality and how people conceive of it, that it's hard to explain why the government is just marching ahead, other than they see some political wins and are determined
that's my thought, that this is, if you can limit and control the content that people generate on the internet, so that, and Stephen Guilbeault, when he was the minister in charge of this, actually was pretty straightforward and just said, we don't want criticism of the government on these websites. Perhaps he said more than he should have. So we're just going to try and break these two bills down. C11, this was supposedly a bill to amend the Broadcasting Act and encompass all of the new online platforms like YouTube and TikTok, and to bring it under the Broadcasting Act, which everybody thought was sort of a flawed process in the beginning anyway, because it's not the same as legacy media. It's a whole different world. And so in the end, and you watched this process carefully, there were a lot of amendments put forward. Some of them actually passed, but there is no obligation on the part of the government to accept any of the amendments that the Senate and through us, all of the users that generate the content for the internet, there's no obligation for them to do it. So where do you think we sit with the changes that have been put forward, or if we end up with the bill as it is?
Yeah. So let me first start by saying, actually, a sense of thanks and I think congratulations, frankly, to the committee and senators from all sides who did the work that, frankly, the House of Commons should have done in the first place. And I think many are grateful that they, at a minimum, had the opportunity to ensure that their voices were heard. And I thought that this should not be as political a bill as it turns out to be, and that I thought the Senate committee did a really good job of focusing on, in a sense, the policy and try to identify some of these issues. And there are amendments I liked, there are amendments I didn't like, there are amendments I liked that I wish they would have passed, but they didn't. But you know what? I don't think Yeah, but you know what? I don't think anybody would walk away from saying that at least this wasn't given a serious consideration, that there was an opportunity to engage in some legitimate debate and a real effort amongst certainly many of you, yourself and many of your
Yeah,
colleagues, to try to find some compromise. Now, I think the big question is, as you highlighted, is whether or not the government is willing to engage in any sort of compromise here. I think, for example, the user content provision is a classic one. Of course, it attracted, I think, an
yeah,
enormous amount of attention. I thought there was a genuine effort by Senators Maville Deschênes and Simons to try to craft something that they said, hey, this is largely what the government, in keeping with the government has said, is their intent. It received support from large numbers
yeah,
of the committee. Obviously, the government may say no, and if they do say no, to me that sends the signal that, notwithstanding the persistent claims that it's not their intent to cover user content, it must clearly be the intent, because
yeah,
this amendment actually does the job of targeting the use case that the Heritage Minister, Pablo Rodriguez, has identified, this notion that sound recordings on, say, a Spotify should be treated the same as when they appear on a YouTube. This does that. But what it also does is seek to try to exclude certain other user content, which the government has said is not their intent. Well, if it's not your intent, this is really the opportunity to kind
yeah.
of put your money
This
where
is
your mouth is.
what many of us kept saying, which is this whole concept, and for those that aren't following as closely as some of us, this user-generated content, the stuff that people put up on YouTube, the exchanges they have, the videos that you see on TikTok, would all of this be subject to essentially Canadian content rules, that the platforms would be required to make sure that Canadian content was pushed forward and other content wasn't, but only some Canadian content, like the Canadian content that they determined. And the users, the folks that generate all the material for these platforms, because the platforms are just a vehicle, they don't actually really create the content. But it was so clear. It was, the government kept saying, we don't want to control user generated content, but then they left things in the bill, and the CRTC chairman himself said, we still have the power to do this regardless of what's in the bill. So they're not putting their money where their mouth is, I guess, is the conclusion.
Well, I didn't think they did when they opposed some of the stuff. I think it
Yeah,
was Senator Dawson that responded specifically to the amendment that was raised, and he was like, "Well, either you trust us and you trust the
yeah,
CRTC, or you don't. And if you don't, well, there's nothing you can do." Well, first off, there is something you can do. You can actually put forward an amendment that is consistent with what you've said you'd like to see the bill do and accomplish, and provide at the same time a greater level of certainty. And further, this notion that, well, you either trust the CRTC or you don't, it feels like even the government doesn't necessarily trust the
right.
CRTC. They've just submitted in court a position that they reject what the CRTC did on the Radio Canada decision over the summer, when the CRTC did not even factor in freedom of expression issues. Now, I'm glad the government is taking a stand for freedom of
Yeah.
expression in that case, but it highlights that, if people have some concern about how the CRTC will interpret some of these provisions and what it will do, I think it's well earned, based on some of the decisions they've made that have effectively even forced the government to step in to say the CRTC's got some of these expression issues wrong.
What do you think is going to happen? Because a couple of the major concerns about this is that the folks that generate all this content might just, house their operations, their own websites offshore in another country, so they wouldn't be subject to this. And the other issue is really the platforms themselves saying, we don't want to play in, above the 49th, because you guys just have way too many rules that don't affect. You can't apply Canadian content rules to the internet. It's an international, global, infinite source of content. It's not like you must play 5 Canadian songs before 10 in the morning, right? It's like, it's a totally different world now.
Right. Well, listen, I think there are a series of things that I think could, or perhaps like will happen if the bill passes. Let's recognize that regardless of whether the government accepts or doesn't accept there will still be some sort of process, potentially, certainly the CRTC at some point in time will be asked to step in if it does pass. There's still the prospect if the government does reject some amendments, and certainly having watch carefully what took place, you get the sense that obviously there will be some that they will reject. We don't know which for sure. And frankly, I hope they do reject the age verification amendment that was put in. It just doesn't fit in this bill. But,
let's just stop on that one,
others,
because that's something that we're seeing a lot from our colleagues in the US. They're very, very concerned about this because this has privacy concerns and everything else. This was in the context of an amendment about controlling the age of people who have access online because of fears of their access to pornography or online, hate, or however you want to describe it. In the States, they're really reacting and saying, look, you can't do that. You can't, that would take, 90% of the viewers of TikTok, it would make them illegal in that sense. They're watching their videos. This is how they engage with one another.
Yeah, well, I have a lot of concerns with respect to this particular provision, which was not debated, or there were not witnesses that appeared before the committee. This was a bad piece of policymaking, and I have great respect for Senator Maville Deschênes. And as I say, I was really glad at her effort to try to find some compromise language on user content. But this felt, with all respect, like an opportunistic attempt to try to just squeeze something in. I think it was a mistake, and I think it was a mistake because it's. Even if you take the position that we need to find some mechanisms to deal with underage access to content that we feel is inappropriate, it's not this is not the right place for it. The kind of the foundation for policymaking wasn't there, and the way that this particular provision is crafted in a way that really could apply to broad services that fit the strict definition and would effectively require age verification for those things. Never mind the concerns around age verification technologies that raise serious privacy related concerns. I mean, I think this is just a bad solution to an issue that may be a problem in some circumstances, but we need to do a better job of identifying sort of a more holistic approach to some of these issues. And I think that would or should be part of what the government does when it eventually comes forward with online safety or online harms legislation. But kind of squeezing it into the Broadcasting Act was a bad look. And even the government opposed the provision in that as part of that debate. And so, if they do take the step of saying, hey, we're rejecting some of the amendments, it feels like that might well be one at the very top of the list.
So do you think, before we move on to the next bill, one of the observations, not an amendment because it wasn't accepted, but one of the observations that came forward from my like-minded group of senators was, at least because we don't even know who the chair of the CRTC will be, the current incumbent is not going to be renewed or won't renew. So there's going to be a new person who is going to be all powerful. And we've asked that person at least come and appear before the committee regularly, maybe on a quarterly basis, as they try to figure out what this bill means, so that there's some, transparency about what's going on.
Yeah, well, listen, I think there's always this tension between the independence of the CRTC and the oversight in government. And I thought that there was a good effort by the committee to try to instill some greater transparency and oversight, reporting mechanisms into what takes place. It was good to see, frankly, the removal of 7 sub 7 from the bill as well, a bill that even the CRTC itself acknowledged that I think very, very late in the day, but Chair Scott finally said, yeah, that's this, if I had my druthers, this would not be in the bill either, that it may actually reduce our independence.
Yeah, the fact that government has a lot, according to this bill, the government will have more say over what the CRTC does. It's supposed to be an arm's length organization, and the outgoing chair said, kind of keep politics out of this. We're a regulatory body. We're not a political body.
Right. And and so, the fact that it took the chair so long to say anything, I thought actually in some ways is illustrative of the problems that we have with the CRTC. I can't imagine the Privacy Commissioner Canada or the chair of the Competition Bureau faced with legislation that would reduce their office's independence, saying nothing for months. I mean, it's just inconceivable that they would do that. The fact that the chair of the CRTC was willing to say nothing until at the very last hour, finally confronted with the question, raises questions about the degree to which the CRTC is functioning in an independent way, or how much is it, essentially seeking to represent the views of the government. And I think that's enormously problematic. And so if we can find ways, and I'm not sure what the best solutions here are, but if we could find ways to restore some of that independence and restore some of the confidence in the CRTC, and I think that if I think even a dispassionate independent observer would say that this has not been a good stretch for the CRTC. Its decision on Radio Canada with content issues, the way it's approached legislative reform have all really, I think, tarnished the reputation of the commission. And so it will fall to whoever the new chair is to try to restore that. And, I think that there are a lot of people who have real concerns even about who that person will be, given that the government has shown a real willingness to step in with respect to the CRTC. And I think violate a central tenet that when it came to office was really crucial. It really took the position that, these are independent agencies. We're going to let them do their thing. That's what good governance is about. And it feels that it's as part of what may be just a slippery slope. It's abandoned, I think, some of that position and has become much more willing to intervene, to pressure some of the outcomes. It's hard to understand why Chair Ian Scott would have said he wants to appear yet again before the Senate, but for some clear external pressure to say, hey, we'd like you to go back and see if you can't try to.
Oh yeah, no,
which I haven't been able to say in the past.
Everybody knew, which is, of course, they wanted to control user-generated content. And when he said it out loud, then everybody said, you got to go back and fix that. And it's really too bad, and it does raise many questions about the distance. The argument that government keeps making about somehow this is all about a safer internet and there's going to be less hate and less content that offends people. I mean, it comes at its core to the whole question of free speech. It's still what really troubles me about this notion that this is one of the places, the internet, where if this is where debate and discussion and speech of all kinds goes on. Free speech is about allowing and dealing with speech that you disagree with, because you want to be able to say what you think that others might disagree with. That's the basic tenet.
Yeah, listen, obviously I feel strongly about the importance of preserving freedom of expression online. I will say that there are clear harms taking place online, and I think it is appropriate for government to seek to address those, to ensure that the platforms are held accountable for what takes place, that they act responsibly, that they're more transparent about some of the processes they're engaged in. So I don't think this is about saying it's just a free-for-all. I don't think it is, or I certainly don't think it should be. And I think we recognize there is a need for some amount of regulation and for platforms to step up and act in a responsible fashion. Part of the problem, though, here is that we're seeing government basically kind of use that broadly accepted proposition for just about everything else. And so when you get into CanCon and broadcast regulation, that's not that. When you get into some of the media related issues, again, that's not that. But yet that's, the government is kind of quick to raise that flag, knowing that, that does engender some support, but yet, people are in a sense being deceived a bit, because that's not fundamentally what those bills are about. There may well be a bill that does seek to address that, and we'll have I'm sure, a very robust debate when that comes. But C11 and now C18 are not fundamentally about those issues at all.
So let's make that distinction for people that don't pay as much attention to all the nuances of Ottawa that you and I do. So C11 was supposed to be these changes to the Broadcast Act to capture the internet into the Broadcasting Act. C18, this is about making the big platforms pay the legacy media outlets, the CBCs, the Rogers, the Teluses in Canada, make them pay those big Canadian operations money every time they say or post something. The CBC said this, or this story appeared on Rogers, that there would be an exchange of money for that process. The big platforms arguing, look, we're just promoting your material. You're putting it out there for the world to see anyway. We're just giving it a new and another audience. Why should we be punished for that?
Right. Well, I think they're saying even more than just that. They're often saying that, listen, in the context, let's say of Facebook, it's users that post links to content.
Right.
They are not the platform is not reproducing the content. They are not republishing it. They're not directly competing with it. They're actually driving traffic, as you say, back to the originating source. And it is their own users that are doing that, including some of the same politicians that are now describing this as theft are themselves posting links to some of these links to news articles. Personally, I think that's a good thing. We want sourcing. We want to deal with misinformation. And so when someone says something in a post on Facebook, and if that's all they say without linking to their underlying source, it can raise questions as to whether or not it's a credible claim or not. The fact that they have 100%. Added the source here is a good thing. It's something we ought to be encouraging. And yet, according to the government, and it was Owen Ripley, who appeared, of course, before your committee and was doing an awful lot of work before both committees, he was asked specifically about this at the House. And he said, well, if you post something without a link, then his view is that falls outside. If it's posted with a link, then his argument was, well, then yes, that it is captured by the legislation. I actually don't think he's even right. I think that the way that this is worded actually would incorporate even posts that have the descriptions. But the idea that somehow a link now triggers this legislation, and so it's in that bucket of something that ought to be compensated, I think is enormously problematic, both with respect to sort of just the basic notion of how we share information online, but also ensuring that we deal with misinformation. Now, the government will respond and say, hey, it's not that specific link. It's sort of broadly all the links that you have to pay for. But that's akin to saying if you buy something in bulk, you're not paying for the specific individual piece in the bulk box. You're paying for an entire box. It's really a distinction without a difference, and it's taking a policy position that this is somehow compensable activity. And I think that's a real danger to freedom of expression. We want people both to be able to speak and to provide source, links to their sourcing. That's the internet's really grown around that. And the idea that the government is saying, well, no, we want to ensure that there's compensation there is a problem. And then we can get into it if you like, even beyond that. Once we get into who the beneficiaries are, primarily large broadcasters, the inclusion of the CBC, where the content itself is already paid for by the public, all of these things I think are really problematic with this bill.
Well, I mean, first and foremost, as you say, sourcing material. Here's a comment online, and then you say, here's the story on CTV or CBC. Go and make up your own mind. Check it out and see what you say. How removing that or discouraging that behavior makes the internet a safer place is kind of beyond me. Like it just seems so flawed.
Yeah, no, I'm in complete agreement. I've argued that it hasn't been recognized, I think, as much as a threat to freedom of expression. But I really do believe that, posting links, whether on their own or as part of some other speech, has an expressive value. I mean, even if it's just the link, it is telling your community or others or whomever happens to reach you that, this is something that I think you may want to check out. I think it's either important or it's interesting or, take the time. There is some expression in the link. And the government is saying, well, that form of expression, when it appears on certain platforms, is something that we think ought to be compensated. And I think it's a mistake. So, even to use the example that I've been talking about a little bit today, which is this Liberal MP, Lisa Hepner, who has called this theft. So she posted a link a few weeks ago to a story on the CBC about the availability of children's medicines, and that there's going to be more of these medicines back when we had a problem. She posted the link both on Twitter and Facebook. Well, first of all, I think the fact that she posted it is a perfectly legit thing. The idea that there should be a problem with there, or somehow it ought to be compensated as a problem. But this bill goes even further, right? I mean, she's calling it theft. So she an accomplice to theft
Yeah,
by
apparently.
posting that
Yeah,
link? But even beyond that, the government's bill would say that the link on Facebook is somehow compensable, but the same link on Twitter is not.
it's not.
And
Yeah,
it's a link to CBC, which, as I say, that's a news story that the public has effectively already paid for.
yeah.
I think on so many levels, this legislation doesn't make sense, or the only sense that you can make of it is that there's been significant lobbying coming from a number of media groups, and so the government has been happy to cave on that issue, even though there are real costs both to expression and even to the independent media sector that stands to face even more robust competition from legacy players that haven't been making the same kind of adjustment they have.
Well, but that's the thing. Like when the legacy players make a mistake and buy the wrong technology, like the Toronto Star, or when they produce programming that consumers don't really watch or flock to, and therefore their ratings are way down, and therefore they can't ask for quite as much money when they sell their ads. I don't, like, why should that become Facebook's problem or Meta's problem or Twitter's problem? These platforms have already said, look, we'll contribute to Canadian content, we'll pay, tax us or send us a bill or whatever. But this notion that they should actually fund legacy media, which is declining in its usefulness or acceptability to the consumer, seems an odd concept.
Yeah, I think it is an odd concept. We've seen these large platforms obviously developed strong advertising models, and we know that some of the media companies have seen some of those ad dollars flow away from them. But
Yeah.
we should be clear, this doesn't have practically anything to do with links to news articles on these
Exactly.
platforms. They've developed a better ad model, or at least one that advertisers have gravitated to. The relevance or importance of news on these platforms is trivial in the case of Facebook. They say it's about 3% of traffic, and when Facebook in Australia briefly blocked access to news sharing, which they now say they may do in Canada,
Yeah.
they saw no change in engagement. The fact that news wasn't available as something to be shared for their users didn't change the amount of activity for their users on the platform. So I have to say, when Facebook here in Canada says, listen, if this goes ahead, and we're talking potentially based on the Parliamentary Budget Officer's estimate of hundreds of millions of dollars to pay for links, and they say if that's what we're facing with no real cap on liability here, because it's based on what users happen to be posting. Right. And we've seen changes even to this bill that have expanded the eligibility requirements so that we now have hundreds of community and campus and Indigenous broadcasters who may not even be required to produce news, yet are treated as eligible news outlets. I mean, it's stunning to see just how everybody now lines up to try to get paid for this. If Facebook says, hey, we're prepared to block news sharing, frankly, I take them at their word. Why would they pay $100 million for links in the current environment when it just doesn't contribute very much to their bottom line? But the costs to Canadians when they want to share some of that information to their community, when new startups, innovative startups, sort of develop social media based strategies for trying to find their users, and yet suddenly they're going to find themselves unable to have their content shared. It's actually going to hurt those innovative players if that's where we end up.
Like free speech and free expression as a concept isn't just a one-way thing. It isn't just my ability to say what I want. It's my ability to hear a range of opinions too. It's a two-way street, and they seem to be missing that element by saying we're going to be so punitive, we might shut that down. We don't want you to reach out and do explore or be curious or check the sources.
Yeah, no, I especially think that the part on the sources is so problematic. I mean, this is you can't, I would go far as to say, you can't seriously claim to be concerned about misinformation online and then erect barriers to allowing people to share the sourcing of the kinds of their posts on a social media service
if
like
there's
Facebook.
Something online that's unacceptable or wrong, you want the public to engage and say that's wrong, right? And here's evidence to the contrary. That's why the internet is supposed to be this open exchange of ideas, right? That you don't get on legacy media.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. And I think we find ourselves in an environment where the government either thinks that it's politically advantageous to
Mhm.
battle it out with these companies to sort of say, hey, these guys are evil, or they're not taking them seriously when they say that they
Yeah.
are, if pressed on this, are going to have to sort of make some difficult business decisions. But I've no inside knowledge, obviously, but
No,
I
no,
could
and but
I could
it
take a look
had
at stock prices. I can take a look at share prices like anybody else. I can
yeah.
see the way these companies have responded in other jurisdictions like anyone else. And so when I see the estimates that are coming either from the government, and let's note the government's estimates are actually less than half of what the parliamentary budget officer
Right.
has said, although they haven't promoted that. But regardless, we're talking in the hundreds of millions of dollars. We've seen Facebook in other contexts say, hey, if that's the case, they're willing to block. We've seen Google respond in European countries where the cost or the increased liability based on the way certain rules have been implemented have led them to stop certain services like a Google News service within the jurisdiction. Anyone who thinks that this is all just one big bluff, because
Yeah.
why would they do that to Canada? I don't think is paying attention.
Well, the other area where it's not a big bluff, and we saw it on C11, and I know we're going to see it again here, is under the rules of the free trade agreement. If you start to try and regulate and extract money from American companies, you are going to face some retaliatory measures from the Americans saying, we want to then control and punish and direct companies in Canada. That's it's going to be a quid pro quo.
Yeah, no, I think the trade implications, the treaty implications are significant here, especially actually with C18.
Yeah.
It has been raised by the USTR, the U.S. Trade Representative Office has expressed concern. In the context of C18, there are copyright treaty related issues. There's a provision in there that says the platforms can't rely effectively on limitations and exceptions on their user rights within copyright. Well, the Berne Convention, which is the international treaty around copyright, has an express requirement that countries preserve a right of quotation. And so if the government is saying that, well, you can't even factor in quotation into your negotiations around this, I think you're running afoul of your obligations under international copyright law. You've now opened the door to hundreds of broadcasters who don't even have to produce news to be eligible for this, so long as you have a CRTC license. Well, those licenses are only available to Canadian broadcasters. They're not available to US broadcasters. When you start talking about discriminatory standards and say, well, there are certain Canadian broadcasters who are eligible for the system, even if they're not required to produce news, the equivalent American broadcasters are not. That sure sounds like the kind of provision that is vulnerable to a trade challenge.
I guess the thing that just underlies all of this that has puzzled me right from the beginning is I don't know how a government anywhere, and I know it's been tried in France and other places, believes that they domestically can control somehow their chunk of this global creature called the internet. We've seen China try to do it, obviously, and have their own system and put up the walls. But in democratic societies, supposedly you can't do that. I think this really is going to unleash a larger debate about whether or not you do that, whether this is really part of how you engage in democratic debate and exchange, which is to control and limit and build walls around it.
Yeah, no, I agree. I agree that there are clearly limits of what any individual country, and certainly Canada, can do with respect
Yeah.
to regulating in this space. That's not to say. My view is that there is still scope for regulation. I think that you have to come at it with some amount of humility. And, in the C11 case, for context, for example, it adopts the approach that internet streaming services anywhere in the world, so long as they touch Canada in some fashion, are subject to regulation. I think that's overbroad. The fact that the government's been consistently unwilling in both the House and the Senate to establish any sort of thresholds to make it clear they're not really talking about everything, I think it's a mistake. I think that we do better to have some amount of certainty there. With respect to the news bill, listen, if the government wants to set up a system that ensures that large platforms contribute more to
Mhm.
news in Canada, To me, the starting point is the tax system. Tax these
Yeah,
companies effectively on the revenue they generate. And if you want to put it
absolutely.
forward within programs to support journalism, fine. You want to go even further and say, hey, we want to establish some sort of fund that funds journalism, but is removed from these issues around paying for links or supporting specific organizations in this way. Again, I would say, okay. And in fact, we've seen some of the companies say, you know what, if part of doing business was a requirement to put forward some sort of contribution that would then go into fund that would more explicitly fund journalism, not fund post media or fund the
The
CBC or
CBC
fund
again. Yeah.
CTV, but rather fund journalism and open to any of these organizations to apply for funding for certain kinds of projects and make sure that it's arm's length. That's the sort of thing I think people could generally get behind. But that's not what we're seeing here. And what we're seeing here has so many negative repercussions that it's a shame that the House didn't engage in a more robust set of hearings.
Yeah.
At one point in time, they had just 3 hearings, and you had some Liberal MPs saying, well, I've heard enough. They ended up opening it up for at least a few more, but there are still so many experts and businesses that haven't been heard from. And I guess my plea coming out of this podcast would be to say, hey, you know what? If anything, the TRCM, your committee showed itself willing to engage in a much more, I think, legitimate, robust policy discussion, hearing from many more witnesses, and I'm really hopeful that we see the same thing take place with C18.
I think we have to do it at a certain point, as we did on Bill C11. We went to those that generate the content, whose livelihoods come from that, and I think that we have to address the issues here too. You've already got government subsidizing mainstream media, which raises a whole lot of questions about their ability to be arm's length. And now it just, this another kind of cash grab to support media when perhaps the market and the consumer and the, the news reader, the news viewer is saying something else through their behavior, which is we want it in a different way.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. I mean, change is taking place. Some adapt better than others. And that's not to say that there aren't needs for effective rules in this environment.
Right,
There are.
exactly.
I want to be clear that that this is not about no regulation.
No,
but I think
absolutely.
but I think we need smart regulation, and I think that both C11 as it ventures into user content and C18 as it quite literally, we heard it repeatedly during the House hearings. The foundation of this bill, we were told, was payment for links, and any attempt to exclude that was called a loophole. And it seems to me that if what you want to say is, hey, pay when you use those materials, when you reproduce those materials, people will get behind that. But that is not what this bill is about.
I got a feeling you're going to come and be testifying at our committee again, because we're going to be going over all of this. And thank you, Michael, for your contributions on this, because you have really been a very important and powerful voice on helping people understand what's really complicated. Even those of us in the business of it here find, wading through legislation a difficult process. So thanks for being out there for us and for the public as well.
Essentially to say thanks for the kind words. And if I'm asked, I'd be happy to appear before the committee. That's for sure.
We'll work on that. Michael Geist, the Canadian Research Chair in Internet and E-commerce Law at the University of Ottawa, is also a member of the Centre for Law, Technology and Society. Thanks again, and we'll see you soon for another edition of No Nonsense.